There are records you're not supposed to read, rooms you're not meant to enter, and names that were erased so thoroughly even the wind avoids whispering them. But tonight, you'll hear one. Whispering Pines. To most, it's just the name of an overgrown field in rural Vermont. Silent now, forgotten, but in the summer of 1889, it burned, and what the fire didn't consume, it exposed. Beneath the rubble, firefighters found steel shackles welded into stone floors, not prison floors, children's cells, medical tools rusted with blood, and pages, soaked in ink and something darker, written by a man the world once praised as a savior of lost youth. They told you this place was a beacon of Christian charity. They lied. For 18 years, the Whispering Pines Orphanage operated as a human laboratory, run by Dr. Ezekiel Harrington, respected surgeon, Civil War veteran, and self-declared architect of moral perfection. His mission wasn't to save children, it was to break them. Those who dug deeper into the remains didn't sleep for weeks. One coroner quit mid-autopsy, another vanished entirely. The official report, sealed, classified, erased from public record until now. Because what Whispering Pines really was, is something this country doesn't want you to understand. A prototype, a test site, the earliest blueprint of psychological control systems that would evolve through centuries into the institutions we still trust today. You see, the experiments didn't die with the fire. They mutated, moved underground, and if you think it stopped with those orphaned children, you've misunderstood the nature of power. Those techniques, pain compliance, emotional deconstruction, loyalty transfer conditioning, they weren't just tests, they were templates. And here's the part you were never meant to know. They worked. The boy who stopped screaming, the girl who watched her sister tortured, and felt nothing. These were not anomalies. They were results. This isn't history. It's a mirror, dusted off and shoved back into your shaking hands, and if you dare to look into it, you'll start to see the methods used against those children still operating today, refined, legalized, and rebranded. You're already in the first chamber now. Every word you hear from this point forward carries a cost, one you'll never pay in dollars. So breathe deep and listen close, because from here on out, the descent begins. They called it a correctional orphanage, but Whispering Pines wasn't built to raise children, it was built to rewire them. The year was 1871. The Civil War was over, but the wounds bled on in silence. Widows, orphans, unwanted mouths to feed, the perfect storm for moral intervention cloaked in Christian language, and standing in that storm was Dr. Ezekiel Harrington. He arrived in Millbrook, Vermont with a reputation already curated. Union Army surgeon, battlefield hero, and pioneer of what he called applied moral science. But titles don't define a man. His eyes did. Cold, calculating, not curious, diagnostic, as if everyone he looked at was already a specimen. He convinced the Burlington Railroad Company to fund the construction of Whispering Pines, said it would turn lost children into model citizens, that he'd reform the nation's future one broken soul at a time. And the town, starving for redemption after war, believed him. A grand 3-story brick monolith rose from the earth like a tomb. 49 rooms, one road in, no road out for the children inside. They called it a sanctuary. He called it his crucible. From day one, Dr. Harrington divided children into classifications: reformables, deficients, and the damning label, irredeemables. But the children didn't know what these terms meant. They only knew some of them disappeared into the basement and never came back the same, if they came back at all. At town gatherings, Harrington quoted scripture with surgical precision, but back behind those locked basement doors he quoted something else, his own doctrine. Through the destruction of the self, we reveal the soul's true obedience. He believed evil was inherited. That trauma was useful. That fear was not something to be healed but harnessed. So he built more than beds and prayer rooms. He built chambers, concrete coffins for the living, designed and pain, not to kill, but to erase emotion, will, memory, all replaced by compliance. The children cried at first, then they stopped. And that silence? The townspeople mistook it for peace, but it wasn't peace, it was conditioning. When inspectors came, they were shown cheerful dormitories, clean halls, and smiling children rehearsed to perfection, but no one asked what was beneath the floorboards. No one heard the soft, muffled banging. No one noticed how some of the children had no names. Because once inside Whispering Pines, identity wasn't just stripped away, it was reprogrammed. And this wasn't a failure of oversight. It was the point. There was no sound in the reflection chambers, just breath, shallow, panicked, eventually mechanical. They weren't called cells. That word suggested imprisonment. No, Dr. Harrington had a different name. Reflection chambers. Rooms without light, without warmth, without dimensions, once your mind fractured from the time. Every brick cold, every surface slick with moisture, every minute engineered to feel like eternity. The child entered as themselves, and what came out, if anything did, wasn't. Each chamber was 6 feet by 4, straw mat, iron door, a slot barely wide enough for a crust of bread and lukewarm broth. Windows? None. Not because Harrington couldn't afford them, but because he knew what darkness did to the mind. He believed suffering stripped away deception, that by breaking the body's rhythm, sleep, nourishment, human contact, you could reach into the core of a child and rewrite it. Children were taken in silence, no warnings, no explanations. 1 minute they were at morning prayers, the next, gone, dragged from dormitories in the dead of night while the others watched, too paralyzed to move. Thomas Kellerman was 8 when they locked him in. He had stolen bread, not for greed, but to feed a younger boy too weak to eat. Compassion. But to Harrington, this was defiance, a threat to institutional control, so Thomas was classified as potentially criminal. That label sealed his fate. The first few days, he screamed, banged the walls, begged, promised to be good. By day 10, he whispered apologies to the dark. By day 21, he stopped speaking. And by day 35, he smiled when Harrington visited. Not because he was happy, but because it was what the doctor wanted. This was called baseline moral realignment. The point wasn't to punish, it was to restructure the soul. Children were rewarded not for obedience, but for sincere gratitude for suffering. That's what the program aimed for, not silence, not compliance, but belief. They had to believe they were defective. They had to believe the institution was saving them. And once they reached that state, Harrington called it a success. But here's the question no one asked. If you can make a child grateful for pain, what can you make a man do? That's why Whispering Pines matters. It wasn't just horror, it was proof. Proof that morality can be installed like code. Proof that a human being can be rewritten. And if they did it to children then, what makes you think it isn't being done to you now? They said the fire was accidental, but fires don't start themselves in sealed basements, especially not on the night a state inspector was scheduled to arrive unannounced. July 3rd, 1889. The smoke rose around 2:14 a.m., first spotted by a rail worker cutting through the woods. By the time the Millbrook Fire Brigade arrived, half the building was engulfed. And the strange part? No one had called them, no bells rang, no alarms, only silence, as if the building itself wanted to burn. Inside there were screams, but not many. Most of the children were already locked in for the night, reflection chambers sealed, dormitories bolted. When the firefighters broke in, they weren't prepared for what they'd find. They expected soot, flame, maybe panicked orphans running for safety. Instead, they found straps, metal chairs, racks of surgical tools scorched black, glass jars filled with organs floating in chemicals, journals half-burned but still legible, each one containing detailed accounts of psychological reprogramming, surgical experiments, and something Harrington referred to only as the concordance. The fire didn't just destroy a building, it unearthed a reality so incompatible with public trust. The state had only one option: seal it. The coroner's report, classified. Autopsy findings, redacted. Survivors, silenced. The official narrative became simple. A tragic blaze in an old, overcrowded orphanage. Cause unknown. No foul play suspected. But here's what slipped through the cracks. A volunteer fireman named Calvin Myers wrote a letter to his wife that night. It was never mailed, found in an attic box a century later. It read, "There's a room they told us not to enter. The captain screamed, said let it burn. But I went anyway. I saw. I don't even know how to write it, Ruth. The walls had faces, drawn, etched in blood maybe, small handprints, too small, and a smell, sweet and rotting, like death had been living there for a long time. This wasn't an accident, this was cleansing. They didn't want us to see what he built. But someone did see. And someone kept records. Dozens of boxes marked E.H., Harrington's initials, were quietly transported not to a courthouse, but to the archives of the Boston Medical Historical Society. Locked away, forgotten, until one cataloging intern opened a journal that began, Entry 1, "The corruption of innocence is the most fertile ground for moral reform, and only through suffering can one reach God. The question isn't what burned, it's what survived." The archives were mislabeled, on purpose. Boxed beneath files on battlefield triage and Civil War medicine, the Whispering Pines journals sat untouched for over 130 years, faded leather covers, fragile parchment, but inside, the sharpest clarity imaginable, diagrams of restraint devices, anatomical sketches of children's bodies, post-procedure, and most chilling of all, the concordance. It wasn't a list, it was a system. Dr. Harrington had created a full behavioral classification model, a manual for identifying, isolating, and correcting undesirable traits in children. Anger, curiosity, affection, empathy. Each trait was given a code, a prescribed sequence of treatments, and a projected timeframe for eradication. It was horrifying in its detail, and breathtaking in its structure, because what he built wasn't just about one orphanage. It was scalable. He wrote, "What we accomplish at Whispering Pines is not limited to orphans. With refinement, this system can be applied to schools, correctional facilities, even families. The mind is malleable. All it requires is isolation, repetition, and reward reconditioning." Sound familiar? If you think this is just a story of a madman in a basement, you're not listening close enough. This isn't about history, it's about blueprints. Because Whispering Pines may have burned in 1889, but its ideas didn't. Over the next 30 years, a wave of behavioral institutions rose across America, each claiming to reform the troubled, the poor, the unwanted. Many of them used identical terminology: moral realignment, emotional regulation, compliance conditioning. Coincidence, or did the concordance leak? We found documents linking Harrington's surviving files to early consultants in the Juvenile Psychodynamics Program, an experimental federal research initiative buried inside the Department of Public Welfare during the 1920s. Language from the concordance appears almost word for word in those files. But here's the real twist. The man who directed that program. His grandfather was a state official in Vermont during the fire, a man who signed off on the final Whispering Pines suppression report. This is how systems replicate, not with loud announcements but with quiet legacy, not in daylight, but in the shadows passed between generations. If they could do this to orphans in 1889, what do you think they've done in the decades since? In schools, in rehab centers, in psychological wellness programs. You think the language changed because the methods did? No. They just got better at hiding it. Comment: silence is design below, twice, if you're starting to understand how deep this goes. It's not just history we're uncovering, it's the mechanism of control itself. What if I told you that Dr. Harrington never vanished? What if I told you his work continued, not just in secret, but in plain sight, under different names, in different forms, protected by the institutions you were taught to trust? After the fire, the official record ends. No arrest, no trial, no confirmed death. Dr. Ezekiel Harrington simply disappeared. And for over a century, no one asked why. until a document surfaced, dated 1892, a request for medical equipment filed under the name Edward Harrow, submitted to a psychiatric asylum in upstate New York. The handwriting matched. The procedural terminology was identical to the concordance. But here's the catch. Harrow wasn't listed as a doctor. He was listed as a consultant, brought in to refine patient compliance protocols. The same year, that asylum quietly expanded its basement. 3 new wings, no explanation, no public record of their purpose. And in the margin of a surviving blueprint, a phrase etched in the exact hand as the Whispering Pines journals: "Compliance is the highest form of worship." Let that sink in. Because this isn't about one man anymore, it's about something far more dangerous: methodology without accountability. When systems prove effective, when they yield results, even horrific ones, there are always men in power willing to preserve them. Think about what happened next in American history: the rise of moral hygiene schools, the forced sterilization campaigns, the eugenics programs, each one targeting the same populations: the poor, the orphaned, the unwanted. These weren't disconnected horrors, they were evolutions, seeds planted at Whispering Pines, now blossoming into policy. You think the past is gone, buried. But what if the past isn't behind us? What if it's beneath us? In basements, in sealed archives, in institutions where the light never quite reaches the lower floor. What if Harrington's real legacy isn't the burned orphanage, but the quiet acceptance that suffering is a tool, that people can be reshaped for the greater good, that morality is something you install, because once you accept that, you're no longer protecting children, you're programming them. And if that sounds familiar, it should. You've seen it before, in the cold language of diagnostics, in the empty eyes of over-medicated students, in the sterile repetition of obedience masquerading as education. The techniques change names, but the agenda never did. Let me ask you something that no teacher, preacher, or politician ever will. Why do the systems that claim to fix us always begin by stripping us of identity? It's not a flaw, it's the foundation. At Whispering Pines, Dr. Harrington had a ritual. Every child admitted was issued a number, not a name, a designation, typed on cards, pinned to collars, carved above their beds. The numbers corresponded not to age or order, but to defect classification, a code from the concordance. You see, the moment a name is replaced by a number, a soul becomes data. That's how you study a human without seeing them. That's how you justify cutting open a child's skull, because number 042 isn't Thomas anymore. He's a variable in an equation. This system, this erasure, was never abandoned. It was refined. Watch how it plays out today. In schools, test scores replace character. Learning differences become disorders. Children become acronyms: ADHD, ODD, ASD, boxed and labeled before they understand what a label means. In prisons, inmates are stripped, numbered, dehumanized. Rehabilitation? No, just compliance conditioning under fluorescent lights. In medicine, patients become case numbers, charts, symptoms, a collection of deficits, each assigned a billing code. Every one of these systems starts by deleting the individual, just like Harrington did. But at Whispering Pines, there was more. A step deeper. He didn't just take their names, he took their mirrors, literally. The dormitories, the chambers, even the bathrooms. No reflective surfaces. Children went years without seeing their own faces. Survivors described it in later testimony. The moment they saw a mirror again, they didn't recognize who was looking back. That was the point. Harrington believed that identity was the enemy of obedience, that if a child knew who they were, if they remembered, they could resist. So he said not only their names but their image, their past, their sense of self. One boy, subject 075, wrote years later, "I forgot my birthday, I forgot my voice, I only remembered how to sit still and how to make him smile." Now ask yourself, when you walk into a government building, a school, a hospital, how long until someone strips you of your name and hands you a number? It's not a convenience. It's a signal, a ritual. The ancient one, the same they used in the orphanage, the same they use now. If you're still with me, it's time to see the next layer. Whispering Pines was a testing ground, but not just for children, for ideology. For centuries, powerful institutions, religious, academic, political, have asked the same question: how do we create obedience that feels like virtue? Dr. Harrington believed he had the answer: not fear, not force, but internalized guilt, engineered so deeply that the subject polices themselves even in silence. He called it moral feedback looping, and it worked like this. Step 1. Isolate the child. Cut them off from all external reference, family, friends, nature, even time itself. Step 2. Introduce a moral ideal, purity, obedience, sacrifice, linked directly to the authority figure. Step 3. Punish deviation not with pain, but with disappointment. Make the subject believe they have failed morally. Step 4. Reward compliance not with freedom, but with forgiveness. Not love, not care, just the absence of punishment, framed as divine mercy. That's the cycle. Over time, the child stops resisting not because they're afraid, but because they believe they are broken, and the only path to healing is to obey more deeply. Now look around. You see this same structure in modern society, in educational models where students are shamed for questioning consensus, in workplaces where team players sacrifice identity for metrics, in social platforms that condition dopamine hits for conformity and shadow ban dissent, in faith systems where doubt is framed as sin and obedience is redemption. Harrington didn't invent this. He revealed it. He distilled something ancient, the formula of control, and tested it without mercy. And the result? Children who thanked their abuser, who cried when they were released, who asked to return to the chamber, because it was the only place they understood how to exist. There's a name for that now. We call it Stockholm Syndrome. Back then, they called it success. You may think, but that was the 1800s. We've evolved. Really? Then why do modern training programs, from military boot camps to corporate retreats, still use isolation, deprivation, identity breakdown, and forced emotional vulnerability as their tools? Because those tools work. Because the concordance was never destroyed. It was adapted. Next, we'll dive into the darkest turn in Harrington's doctrine, a place even his followers feared, what he called the Severance Protocol. The Severance Protocol was Harrington's final stage, the most extreme, the most guarded. It was rarely used, reserved for children who refused to break under the moral feedback loop, those who clung to something real, a memory, a voice, a sibling, a belief that the world outside the orphanage was still waiting for them. These children, Harrington called them the anchors. In his writings, he claimed anchors posed the greatest threat to spiritual reformation. He believed their resistance was evidence of infestation, a term borrowed from ancient monastic texts describing soul infections. Harrington was convinced that some children were possessed, not by demons but by dangerous forms of individual will, free will, and that free will had to be surgically removed. Hence, the Severance Protocol. The process began with what Harrington termed narrative disruption. The child was kept awake for days, fed conflicting stories about their past, shown forged letters claiming their family had abandoned them or died. Step 2. Sensory deprivation. Not just darkness and silence, but blindness hoods, gloves to deaden touch, foul tastes on the tongue. The goal: erase the body's memory of feeling. Step 3 was the chamber. The chamber was different from the reflection cells. This one was soundproofed, coffin-sized, and carved with phrases in dead languages: Latin, Aramaic, ancient Hebrew. According to the journals, the inscriptions weren't just symbolic. Harrington wrote, "Symbols matter more than substance. Words carved in faith change the shape of perception. The child must believe they are no longer in the realm of men." Inside, the child would remain for 40 days. Yes, 40. Biblical, ritualistic, no food, only water and whispered scripture through a wall slit. Most broke within a week. Some hallucinated visitations, not of God but of the voice. Always discern, abed the same way across testimonies, a hollow female tone speaking from behind their left ear, gentle, calm, instructing them to let go. But those who did let go, they emerged transformed. Gone were the tears, the tremors, the fear. They were silent, still, obedient beyond comprehension. Harrington marked them in his log with a single Latin phrase, factum est. It is done. Let me be clear. This wasn't therapy. This wasn't healing. This was a ritualistic deletion of self. Now think, how many modern techniques echo this today? Isolation tanks, forced fasting, rebirthing therapies, silent meditation retreats marketed as enlightenment, when they borrow tactics of identity fragmentation. When you strip away every layer of a person until they're blank, someone else gets to do the rewriting. Ask yourself, how much of what you believe about yourself was given to you, and what parts were severed before you even had a choice? If you're ready to descend into the real origin of Harrington's methods, the ancient doctrine he didn't invent, only reactivated, most people think Dr. Ezekiel Harrington was just a cruel man with radical theories. They're wrong. He was a disciple. Because deep within the unburned pages of the Concordance, buried under layers of clinical language and fabricated science, there's a hidden lineage, a philosophy that did not begin in Vermont, or even in the West. It began in Tyre, 612 BC. Ancient Phoenician records, translated only in fragments, speak of a priestly order known as the Lamenters of Ashan. They were not worshippers, they were purifiers. Their purpose? To cleanse corrupted vessels, usually children, through suffering, silence, and sacred forgetting. Sound familiar? They believed identity was a curse, that the soul, born perfect, became polluted by memory, desire, family, and love. To restore it, they used isolation, chanting, and something called the hollowing, a rite where the child was stripped of name, language, and dream. This is where Harrington found his blueprint. You see, during his time at the École de Médecine in Paris, he spent a year abroad studying obscure esoteric rites under Father Armand Duval, a theologian excommunicated for conducting experiments on orphans in Marseille. Duval possessed ancient scrolls, illegally acquired, that detailed the rituals of the Lamenters. Harrington didn't reject them. He refined them. He blended ancient doctrine with Victorian pseudoscience, wrapped ritual in reason, gave torture the mask of therapy. One passage from his personal journal, not the Concordance, chills the spine. The ancients erased to sanctify, we erase to program, but both serve the same aim, remaking man in the image of the unseen will. That unseen will became his God, not the God of Scripture, not the God of mercy, but a silent architect he called the design. He taught his inner circle that every human being was born with unauthorized data, a contamination passed in, said through bloodlines, folklore, dreams. The only way to purify the child was to delete the inherited self. Harrington didn't see Whispering Pines as a school. He saw it as a temple, and every orphan within its walls was a sacrificial offering, not in blood, but in identity. Let that sink in. Because if Harrington was right, if modern systems are still rooted in this ancient code, then the forces controlling your behavior aren't just political or psychological, they're ritualistic. The education system, the corporate structure, the medical models of compliance, even the screens we stare into every day, all engineered to hollow, to make space for something else. By now you've seen the pattern. Not just abuse, not just corruption, but design. And the question that has haunted every serious investigator of Whispering Pines, the one buried under decades of sealed archives, redacted files, and mysteriously vanished witnesses, is this. If they erased the children, what did they put in their place? Because what emerged from the severance protocol was not a blank slate, it was reprogrammed. Let me take you to an internal memo dated February 1890, months before the fire that ended it all. It wasn't addressed to Harrington, but to a man named Sebastian Knox, a government liaison from a covert department under the U.S. Bureau of Ethnology. a division responsible not for studying cultures, but for modifying them. The memo reads, Subject groups 063 to 089 display remarkable uniformity post-severance. No nightmares, no rebellion, highly adaptive to command simulation. We propose escalation to Phase 4, external reintegration. Signed, RD Concordance Subsection Theta. Phase 4. That's the key. Because Whispering Pines didn't just break children, they trained them to follow orders without question, to suppress memories on cue, to adapt instantly to new names, homes, and missions. You ever heard of the Lost Boys program from the early 1900s, the sudden appearance of unusually disciplined orphans placed into elite academic and military tracks across the eastern seaboard? That was Phase 4. They were implanted into society, into boarding schools, private companies, even early intelligence operations. Men with no past, no records, but perfect behavioral obedience. And guess what? Some of them thrived. They became inventors, CEOs, judges, senators, even psychiatrists. And they carried something with them, something invisible. The imprint. See, the severance protocol wasn't just trauma, it was an encoding ritual, one based on ancient Phoenician practices. When the child was emptied, they were implanted with a symbol. Not one you could see with your eyes, but one that lived in pattern, in instinct, in reflex. A psychic scar, some theorized, others believed it was a seed, waiting to be activated by external triggers, sounds, images, phrases, even frequencies. Sound crazy? Then explain why several descendants of known Whispering Pines survivors reported experiencing sudden blackouts, foreign speech, violent episodes upon exposure to specific tones or light pulses. What was programmed didn't die. It waited. Now, ask yourself, why are certain tones used in corporate sound logos? Why are children's cartoons built on rhythmic triggers? Why do national anthems sound like incantations? Maybe you're not reacting to the content. Maybe you're reacting to the imprint. You've heard the official story. The fire at Whispering Pines in December of 1890 was ruled accidental. A kerosene lamp tipped over in the chapel during a storm. High winds. Dry wood. 18 children perished. Dr. Harrington's body was never found. Neat. Clean. Final. Lies. The real story. It wasn't a fire. It was a purge. Let's start with a document buried in the Vermont Historical Society archives. It's dated 3 days before the fire. An unsigned directive sent to the governor's office labeled Priority Clearance, Level Black. Only 6 words were written. Protocol breached. Theta assets must vanish. Theta assets. The same label from the Concordance subsection. Now, follow the money. In the months leading up to the Orphanage's accident, several large donations were funneled into Whispering Pines under the name Auburn Holdings. But Auburn Holdings wasn't a person. It was a shell corporation, a front for a consortium known as the Dominion Trust Circle, a secretive alliance of industrialists, clergy, and intelligence operatives who believed in one goal: creating a controllable human class through ritualized obedience. The trust had links to early rail tycoons, Ivy League institutions, even spiritualist movements of the time. They weren't after money, they already had that. What they wanted was control over development, psychological development, because they believed, and documented, that the human brain, before the age of 7, could be shaped like wax. And they saw Harrington's work as the mold. So why the purge? Because something escaped. In October of 1890, a boy named Nathaniel Greaves fled the compound during a thunderstorm. He was found by a trapper 2 miles from the orphanage, near the edge of the Whispering Pines bog, shivering and mute. But when he was brought to the local doctor, something happened. According to the doctor's diary, the boy looked at me, unblinking, and whispered in a voice that was not his own, "They have no faces. They walk beneath the roots. They made me forget my sister's name." but I remember now. The doctor contacted a colleague in Boston. 2 weeks later, the fire. No survivors, no witnesses, no remains of Dr. Harrington or the inner circle. But strange sightings were reported for months, figures in black coats loading trunks into carriages at night, children escorted away under guard, town records mysteriously lost in a flood that spring. And Auburn Holdings? It vanished from all public registries in January 1891, reappearing 6 years later under a new name, the Ashcroft Institute of Behavioral Development. Today, it operates under a different title, one you'd recognize, but we'll get there. But by 1891, Whispering Pines was ash and ruin, but the ideology, it migrated. Not openly, not loudly, but like a virus changing hosts, it took on new names, new forms. The core principles of Dr. Harrington's severance protocol didn't die in that fire. They were absorbed, repackaged, and embedded into mainstream systems that most of us were raised under. Let's follow the trail. After the fire, 3 key figures from the concordance, Dr. Alistair Munn, Sister Callista Rhine, and financier Reginald Crowther, reappeared quietly across the eastern seaboard. Munn became an early director at Ashcroft Institute of Behavioral Development, located just outside Baltimore. Rhine resurfaced as head of a new teacher training program in Connecticut, developing methods for moral standardization in early childhood classrooms. Crowther founded a mysterious fund called the Children's Reform Allocation Board, which channeled millions into youth correctional facilities and state orphanages. And what did all 3 have in common? They began promoting something called the 4-phase compliance arc, a method nearly identical to the old severance structure. But here's where it gets darker. In 1903, the Ashcroft Institute released a classified research paper titled Inductive Identity Shaping Through Routine Exposure, a Scalable Model. Declassified only in 1981, this paper outlined uniform dress codes to suppress individuality, rigid scheduling to induce compliance, symbolic rewards to rewire motivation, public correction to instill social surveillance, controlled failure cycles to normalize shame. Sound familiar? You experienced this. If you went to any public school, this structure was your daily reality, not because it worked for learning, but because it conditioned obedience. Even the timeout chair traces back to the reflection cells of Whispering Pines. And by the 1920s, the model was scaled nationwide, funded by new philanthropic organizations like the Rhodes Trust, the Carnegie Foundation, and later the Rockefeller Board of Child Welfare, each of which had, hidden deep in their ledgers, contractual overlaps with Ashcroft and Auburn legacy accounts. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented movement. The Whispering Pines doctrine, the belief that identity should be stripped, shaped, and programmed, became the foundation of military boot camps, juvenile detention centers, early childhood education models, behavioral health facilities, and elite prep schools that produce America's ruling class. These institutions weren't broken by accident. They were engineered that way. Ask yourself, why does the system punish curiosity, emotion, rebellion, but reward silent conformity? Because it still serves the original goal, not to educate, but to install. You've been asking the right question. Who's behind it now? Because this isn't ancient history, this isn't folklore, this isn't just a story. It's a living network, and its blood runs through some of the most powerful families in America. Let's begin with the Halverton line. Reginald Crowther, the financier who vanished after the Whispering Pines purge, quietly changed his name in 1896 and married into the Halverton family, New York industrialists known for their iron empire. Their descendants, politicians, media moguls, defense contractors. One, in particular, stands out. Elijah Halverton III, former CEO of Larchgate Learning Systems, the single largest private developer of educational testing software in the U.S. Larchgate's standardized exams are used in over 14,000 school districts, designed not just to test, but to rank, label, and funnel children into predetermined futures. And guess who funded Larchgate's earliest research? Ashcroft Behavioral Institute. Still think the fire ended it? Let's go deeper. The Munn family, descended from Dr. Alistair Munn, now runs the Bastion Institute for Child Psychology, a think tank advising federal policy on juvenile behavior. Their programs include AI-driven behavioral grading, emotional pattern mapping, and biometric mood tracking. They call it progress, but it's just Severance 2.0, digital now, invisible. And the Rhineline? Callister Rhine's niece married into the Whitgrave dynasty, owners of one of the largest private military consulting firms in the world. Whitgrave Security trains operatives in psychological control, resistance suppression, and memory containment. They literally teach erasure. One insider report from 2014 revealed that Whitgrave operatives were running identity reset simulations on orphans trafficked from war zones, exactly the methods described in the old concordance journals. And there's one more piece. A name whispered through old Ashcroft files and insider testimonies, the Veiled Circle. Not a company, not a government entity, a blood alliance. Descendants of the original Whispering Pines, inner circle, bound by oath, bound by belief, quietly steering. Youth behavioral tech, curriculum standards, private equity in childcare data platforms, screen time algorithms for learning apps, even rehabilitation models for prisoners and political dissidents. Their motto, structure is salvation. But structure for whom? Because for them, freedom is the disease, and they're still vaccinating society against it, one generation at a time. Symbols, they're everywhere, on your phone, in your classroom, in your child's bedtime show, in the silence between corporate jingles and military recruitment ads. You've been taught they're just logos, just marketing, just coincidence, but they're not. They are keys, ancient psychological triggers evolved from the original Whispering Pines ritual design, encoded to bypass conscious resistance, engineered to reach the place Harrington called the root mind. Let's dissect them. Start with the Ashcroft spiral. Still used by its successor organization, the Behavioral Research Advancement Group, BRAG. It's a double-coiled spiral inside a square. They say it represents balanced growth. But that spiral appears first in Harrington's own notebooks, labeled Induction Glyph A, a pattern used to hypnotize children during the Severance Protocol's early sessions. The square, meant to represent the cell, the boundary, the program. It didn't disappear. It migrated into school logos, tech startup branding, even popular children's streaming content. Then there's the three-dot motif, used today in everything from educational apps to juvenile detention program seals. 3 dots arranged in a triangle. Harmless? No. That symbol traces back to Phoenician priesthood sigils, later adopted by early Rosicrucians, and eventually reappeared in Whispering Pines chapel stained glass. It represents trifurcation, the psychological split into obedient self, observing self, and suppressed self. Or, as Harrington wrote, divide the child, fragment the will, make one obey, one observe, one sleep. Still think that loading screen is just design? Now, sound. Remember the lullabies you heard as a child, the melodies embedded in startup chimes, the reward tones in learning games? Many share a 4-note scale developed from Whispering Pines auditory studies, tuned specifically to EVO. Key early developmental comfort reflexes. It's a digital pacifier. Even major tech companies use this tone cluster, repackaged as a brand identity. But here's the key. It's not about meaning. It's about repetition. Symbols work not because you understand them, but because your mind has seen them 10,000 times. You become familiar, then you become open, then you obey. Why do toddlers cry when they don't get screen time? Why do adults panic when their phone buzzes? Why does a corporate logo make your body relax? Because your root mind doesn't see a screen. It sees the glyph. We've been programmed, slowly, beautifully, silently. But there's hope. They thought no one escaped. They thought every child at Whispering Pines was either lost in the fire or rewritten. They were wrong. 6 survived. 6 children slipped through the cracks of the severance protocol, not because they were lucky, but because something in them refused. Call it divine spark, call it ancestral memory, call it resistance. The most documented of these survivors was a boy named Thomas Kells, born in 1882, admitted to Whispering Pines in 1888 after his mother's sudden death, records say accidental drowning, though her body was never found. Kells underwent 2 full cycles of the severance protocol. His file was marked responsive, compliant, but something shifted during his 3rd induction phase. According to declassified Ashcroft internal memos, Thomas Kells rejected the trance state. He began humming at specific frequencies during isolation periods. He started rearranging objects in his cell into mirror patterns, counter symbols. And during one group session, he stood up mid-ritual and spoke clearly. "You can shape the shell, but I will remember the flame." Within weeks, he escaped. How? No one knows. Some say he fled during the fire. Others believe someone from the inside helped him, possibly Sister Marin, a low-ranking caregiver who vanished the same night. What matters is what happened next. Kells traveled under different names for decades. He lived as a bookseller in Philadelphia, a school janitor in Albany, a lighthouse keeper on the Maine coast. But in each town, he left behind coded manuscripts, spiral-bound notebooks filled with strange symbols, ciphers, and reversed severance glyphs. His drawings show mirrored versions of the same indoctrination spirals, distorted in ways that broke their effect. Psychological weaponry turned against its creators. These notebooks became known in certain circles as the Lantern Pages, circulated quietly, smuggled across states. Eventually, portions of them were published in an underground journal in 1973 called Echoes of the First Fire. Inside were exercises, simple rituals, breathing techniques, eye positioning protocols, dream interruption commands, all designed to do one thing: reclaim the inner self. And guess what? They work. In private tests conducted by ex-Ashcroft defectors in 1994, participants exposed to high-frequency behavior stimuli who used the lantern exercises showed complete immunity to automatic obedience cues. One senior analyst wrote, "It's like watching a ghost wake up. They stop nodding. They start asking." So what does this mean for you? It means that your programming is not final. It means the control system can be resisted, but only through knowledge and ritual. You must disarm the symbols and rewire your autonomic triggers. Now we move from exposure to action. You've seen the ruins, you've heard the whispers, you've traced the bloodline and symbols. But what will you do about it? Thomas Kells, one of the few children to survive the Whispering Pines purge, didn't run from the system. He decoded it, and he left behind tools not just for remembrance but for resistance. The most powerful, something called the reversal spiral, a ritual pattern designed to undo the imprinting of psychological control. It begins simply. You sit with pen and paper, no screens, no interruptions, just presence. You draw a clockwise spiral from the center outward, the same direction used by Ashcroft glyphs and indoctrination visuals. This activates the obedience loop buried deep in your subconscious. As you draw, say aloud, "This is not mine. This was given." 7 times. You then reverse it. New page. Start from the edge. Draw the spiral inward, counterclockwise. The forbidden direction used by mystic circles long before Ashcroft, long before Harrington. This is the extraction spiral, the pattern of recovery. Speak aloud. This is mine. This is the shape of return. 7 times. Why does this matter? Because symbolism is not metaphor, it is instruction. To your nervous system, your fear centers, your habits, your compliance reflexes. Every spiral drawn and embedded by the severance protocol was a loop, a trap. Thomas Kells discovered that reversing the direction, while consciously declaring intent, disrupts the loop. Over time, this causes symbolic disobedience to awaken, but it doesn't end with drawing. You complete the reversal spiral with breath, 9 times, you inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 7, exhale for 8. Each exhale whisper, return, restore, reclaim. This breath pattern, also found in pre-Ashcroft East Anglian monastic healing manuals, directly interrupts the automatic panic responses triggered by control symbols. This is not mindfulness. This is ritual warfare. Those who've performed the reversal spiral daily for 33 days report strange clarity. Memories long buried return. Dreams shift. Certain logos, chimes, and behavioral cues no longer control them. You're not just remembering, you're reprogramming the weapon they buried in your mind and turning it against them. But knowledge is nothing without the tools to challenge their language in public. Some truths weren't erased, they were poisoned. Thomas Kells didn't stumble on answers, he provoked them. Not with rebellion, not with shouting, but with something far more dangerous. Precision questions. He believed that words, if carefully aimed, could puncture the veil around people's minds, not to argue, not to debate, but to trigger collapse in real time. These weren't just questions, they were mental disruptors. When whispered in boardrooms, classrooms, courtrooms, or churches, these phrases changed everything. People grew silent. Some laughed nervously, others got angry. But one thing always happened. The illusion twitched. The questions were never complex. In fact, that was their genius. They were simple, too simple, which is why no one saw them coming. But once released, they sank into the subconscious like a splinter beneath the skin. And they stayed there. Kells tested them in every environment, in therapy sessions, at political rallies, inside government training modules. He said they didn't reveal truth, they revealed reaction. Because when a mind is owned, even a gentle nudge becomes a blade. The results were always the same. If someone paused, stared into the distance, confused, Kells would nod. That's the first crack. If they changed the subject, the spell was deep. If they got angry, even deeper. But the worst ones smiled, said, "That's interesting," and moved on without blinking. Those were the truly lost. Kells wrote that, "Real change begins when a man feels his programming, not just hears about it." These questions weren't for research, they were for awakening. And once you start asking them, even in silence, your world begins to shift. Conversations lose their plastic gloss, symbols lose their power. You begin to see who's speaking and who's just repeating. But beware, these words can't be unspoken. Once they leave your mouth, something inside you won't go back. There's a reason they chose children. Not because they were weak, but because they were unwritten. Before a child knows who they are, what they believe, what is safe or sacred, someone else writes it in for them. Language, symbols, fear, approval, shame. And in 1889, the operators of Whispering Pines understood this better than any scientist of their era. Dr. Harrington wasn't running an orphanage. He was building a compliance laboratory. The children brought to Whispering Pines weren't just victims of war or poverty. Many were chosen, selected, taken from bloodlines marked in old Ashcroft registries, families with high emotional sensitivity, high memory retention, and rare neurological patterns. These weren't ordinary orphans. These were the ideal substrates. You see, a traumatized adult resists control. Their defenses are crude but present. But a child, especially one already broken by loss, is soft clay. And what Harrington discovered was chilling. Certain children, if exposed to the correct sequence, isolation, rhythmic sound, emotional rupture, then symbolic imprinting, would absorb belief systems faster than any adult ever could, not temporarily, permanently. They weren't just teaching the children obedience. They were rewriting the very way they formed reality. Some were told they were sick, others that they were chosen. Many were given alternate names, new birthdays, new memories, and by the time they were done, these children could no longer distinguish between memory and command. To the outside world, they were model students, quiet, disciplined, grateful. Inside, they were blank pages, programmed to obey whoever held the pen. And then they were sent out. Some became teachers, some social workers, others clergy. Each was unknowingly carrying forward the infection, speaking in tones that matched Harrington's, using phrases designed not to educate, but to contain. This was the real legacy of Whispering Pines, not death, but duplication. And Kells, who escaped that fate, spent the rest of his life undoing the voice in his head that wasn't his. He said it felt like peeling off skin, one memory at a time, until he could hear his own thoughts again. He left warnings, maps, rituals of recovery. But most of all, he left the final truth, that the children weren't the end. They were the beginning. Whispering Pines didn't burn. It evolved. The mistake people make when they hear stories like this is thinking they're historical, that it's over, that the horror is sealed in dusty rooms and yellowed files, that ghosts stay in the buildings where they were created. They don't. They follow the blueprint. Thomas Kells spent the last 6 years of his life tracing those blueprints across North America, not just in orphanages, in schools, in psychiatric clinics, in behavior labs, in juvenile detention programs funded by silent donors with military ties. Different names, different coats of paint, but the same methods. Silence, isolation, confusion, reward, symbol, imprint, the Whispering Pines model. By 1948, that model had no walls at all. It didn't need them. Television replaced hymnals. Radio replaced sermons. Standardized testing replaced confession. And the glowing screen replaced the stained glass window. The rituals didn't vanish. They digitized. Kells found a private institute in Maryland using the same memory erasure sequences. He documented a behavior modification lab beneath a school in Missouri. He infiltrated a wellness center in California with logos matching the carvings on the beds at Whispering Pines. He wasn't searching for proof. He was trying to warn us. The institution was never the threat. The process was, and the process now lives in apps, in feeds, in terms and conditions, in everything that praises obedience, demonizes curiosity, and rewards the emotionally compliant. You're not just being watched, you're being calibrated. Every recommended video, every mood tracker, every auto-corrected phrase is one brushstroke in the same painting that began in Vermont, 1889, not with machines, but with belief systems. Whispering Pines was a prototype. Your world is the production model. The children were the test run. You are the perfected, the product. And unless you choose to fracture the voice inside you, the one that sounds helpful, polite, responsible, proper, but isn't yours, you will carry forward the infection. Kells died in silence. No grave, no marker. But his final manuscript ended with a warning etched into the last page. You are not the author of your thoughts, but you must become the editor before they write your ending. This was the story of Whispering Pines. It was never a tragedy. It was a manual. And now that you've read it, you are no longer innocent. Welcome to Unholy Word. We don't tell stories. We break spells.